Chapter 2. The road that had for a time carried the Mornsong bridal party was connected to many others, branching across the countryside. Some were heavily trod arterials, smooth and wide. Others were narrow and overgrown paths that barely qualified as roads. It was one of the latter variety, an old trail out of favour with most travellers, that led a strange pilgrim to a grisly sight, hanging from the side of a cracked dead ash. The pilgrim wore a wide-brimmed metallic hat that mediated the flames on her head, but her skin was alight with pale orange flame that pulsed in time with her breathing. The pilgrim's steady pace slowed, caution lifting her pointed chin. She tossed her head back with a short jerk to widen her field of vision and stared silently at the morbid display. At first the fiery traveller supposed the corpse was an eyeblight, executed at the stake. It was a punishment prescribed by many elf tribes. She'd never heard of the gilt-leaf elves using such methods, but she hadn't been through the territory in years. When she recognized the bound remains, living curls of flame flared around her shoulders. Her chest convulsed with blunt, sickening jolts, and her eyes grew bright with shock. The grisly marker was one of her own, a flamekin. One of the burning folk from the crags had come here, just as she had. Only that distant cousin was dead, long dead. The lifeless, extinguished body had been exposed for some time, perhaps years. The dead flamekin's face had been degraded to brittle rock, and its torso had crumbled and cracked around the strong, thin coils of elven rope, holding it fast to the dead, dry tree. One arm ended in a jagged stump, inches below the shoulder. The other was intact, but nearly skeletal, and it looked as if it might snap off in a strong breeze. The legs had worn away to tapered points that hung like stalactites over a patch of dead earth. Coal black skin that had once burned with living, breathing flame was blotchy and grey. The pilgrim was shocked, but that shock didn't last long. Such displays and warnings were all too common in the elf nations. It made sense that the strongest of the elf nations would be the most strident, the most exacting and cruel. Elves didn't consider anyone but elves to be truly intelligent. Not the towering giants, not the tiny, fluttering fairies, not anything in between. Elf territory was vast, and elves tended to enforce their harsh standards on all they encountered and subjugated. The elves were not at the top of the food chain, they were the top of the food chain. The pilgrim automatically focused on the reason her wanderings, her purpose, and with effort regained control. The shock of her murdered kin faded quickly, though the unsettled disgust did not. Her eager determination to continue remained unchanged. Dead flamekin or no, she was impelled in this direction by that which guided her. Judging from the condition of the path and the fact that she'd seen no other such warning from the gilt-leaf, she saw no reason to turn back. The flamekin fell in and out of favour with the blessed nation depending on who was in power. They mostly served as couriers, one of the few jobs for which the elves deemed the pilgrim people worthy, and no pilgrim was foolish enough to refuse. It was likely that that dead flamekin dated from a period of disfavour. The pilgrim paused only to draw an ancient glyph of farewell in the air before her face. The burning symbol hung there for a fraction of a second before dissolving into curling wisps of white smoke. The brief but compulsory observance was all she had time to perform. The pilgrim was following her path, as pilgrims did, but that didn't mean she couldn't choose a fork every so often that would quicken her pace when it became urgent to reach the next stop on her long road. There wasn't far to go for her immediate destination. In the distance she could just make out the bells of the Merrow ferryman, and if she survived the short journey from here to there, she'd be closer than ever to her ultimate goal. The pilgrim adjusted her hat, lowering the brim over her eyes. If she were lucky, she might even get a glimpse of what the ultimate goal was. Her wry humour faded when she remembered something unusual about the vile but all too common warning sign, something that forced her to delay her progress a few moments more. She turned back to the dead flamekin to inspect it more carefully. Elves that used these warnings invariably made them quite specific. If they wanted to keep a flamekin out, they killed a flamekin and tied it up to a dead tree. If they wanted to say no boggarts allowed, a dead boggart would be hung every few miles across the road that bordered the boggart warrens. This warning sign, however, was not just a flamekin corpse. Beneath the dead thing's corroded legs were carefully stacked bones. The shapes were vaguely Kifkin-like, but the skulls seemed deformed. The skeletal limbs ended in stubby black claws. Even those appeared to have belonged to juveniles and infants. Placed among the bones were bits of coloured glass, greasy feathers of brown, blue, and green, and bent fragments of thick, nearly worthless copper thread. The bark of the dead ash had been adorned with a simple pictogram drawn in charcoal and chalk, though none of the symbols reached higher than the pilgrim's chest. "Boggarts," the pilgrim said, and her pulse visibly quickened in the flames at her neck. That dead ash tree, the foundation of the shrine and the final resting place of her dead cousin, looked highly flammable. The boggarts needed to learn that no good would come from worshipping the dead flamekin in this fashion, especially if it inspired them to try and make it their own. The pilgrim tossed back her hat. Flames swept from her, blindingly bright. A sound much like that of thunder crossed with a giant stamping its foot boomed. The air stank of singed, filthy hair. The boggarts were still wailing in despair over the burning shrine when the pilgrim left the overgrown arterial behind and stepped onto the wider lane that led to the banks of the wanderwine. The Merrow bought their Cramog towns amid the slow but steady currents in the low country, Wanderwine River. These structures of wood, stone, rope, and netting were split into dry upper sections where Merrow and landwalkers could interact easily, and the much larger, more open chambers beneath the river's surface for the Merrow alone. There were cranogs for every purpose: permanent homes, piers, way stations, storm shelters, and even the odd Kifkin Run tavern for the rivergoers looking to relax. Merrow preferred to deal peacefully with landwalkers and built cranogs adjoining landwalker docks that connected to landwalker roads. There most two-legged folk, save boggarts who hardly counted, were welcome. In one such cranog, a flamekin pilgrim had recently paid for passage with a particular Merrow ferryman named Sygg, Captain Sygg, to be specific. He was singing, but broke into a hum when he reached the verse, following the willowy Merrow warrior maiden's heroic rescue of the helpless, albeit dashing, Merrow ferryman. He was trying to attract additional patrons after all, and it was hardly cost-efficient to cross the Wanderwine with just a flamekin, and there was no point in driving away landwalker parents with landwalker young. Sygg might as well continue the song, he decided, and he would have if he hadn't already shifted into a different, thoroughly bawdy ballad he was now compelled to complete. Of late, the wharf was devoid of potential customers, and today appeared ready to follow suit. In fact, Sygg was the only ferryman operating in this run at the moment, the others already having moved to busier routes, and there was still barely enough traffic to make it worth his while. The road to Kinsvale had grown less popular thanks to the damned boggarts. Even so, there was some big celebration coming up in the bustling Kifkin town, and soon the wharf wasn't completely empty. In fact, the captain hoped he might end up half at capacity. At least that would be a mild workout. Sygg believed that he didn't get enough chances to stretch. "And how many of you will be travelling with me today, ma'am?" asked Sygg's first mate, a relatively green in every sense of the word Merrow named Duga. The captain had taken the youth on as an apprentice as a favour to Duga the elder. The apprentice's primary duty was to act as a steward, but he also collected fares, and on those rare occasions Sygg took a charter for a long run down the lanes to a distant port of call, Duga was the cook, no mean task upon the running surface of a fast-moving river, but skillfully preparing a delectably seared silver-fin steak under improbable conditions didn't give young Duga any skills with people whatsoever. The lad's waist barely even cleared the water, and Sygg knew that he had reminded his apprentice that the ferryman had to have the dignity and respect to meet potential passengers in the eye, and it wasn't as if these passengers were giants either. Sygg sighed and slowly let himself drift over to his apprentice, while making a display of checking the wind with one thumb claw. 1, 2, 4, 4, the Kifkin matron said, counting herself and the 3 small children on her fingers. 4, Duga said, and then did some painstaking figures in his head for all of 15 seconds. The figure he offered made the matron's eyes bulge in shock. Duga the younger had no business coming within 10 miles of a paying passenger, and the lopsided deal he offered the Kifkin made the captain's gills twitch. Sygg had let the sentiment guide him into agreeing to teach Duga what he knew, but it was clearly not sinking in. If Sygg ever made that sentiment again, he would drown it. Though it broke a promise he made himself only the day before, the ferryman cleared his throat, flared the spiny crest atop his head, and swam up to the deck to interrupt before the offended Kifkin matron voiced her indignation beyond a stammering sputter. "Mr. Duga, it's clear she's with a small fry now, isn't it?" Sygg said graciously. "We can't charge a full fare for such a wee kiflings." With a sly, slow wink at the trio of children behind the diminutive woman, an adult Kifkin stood eye to chest with a short elf, which made it easy for the Merrow to meet her eye to eye with little effort of his tail that his apprentice could not apparently manage. He added, "At your service, missus." The Kifkin children, Sygg guessed from their clothes, were 2 females and a male. Met his friendly banter with eyes as wide as saucers. Sygg had always had a knack for reading landwalker expressions, or so he told himself, more so than the average Merrow. He cheerfully misread the Kiflings' frightened faces and met their growing terror with a throaty chuckle that made his gills flap, eliciting squeals of alarm. "Thank you," the Kifkin woman said. Her pale, fuzzy landwalker skin was flushed pink with the effort of pulling her travelling trunk and herding 3 Kiflings. "Don't mind them. It's their first river crossing. We took the airship to see my sister, you see, in Dunshire, and let's call it there," Sygg said before the Kifkin could get too far. He extended a webbed, 3-fingered hand towards the Kifkin matron. She fumbled with one of the many woven bags she wore slung across her shoulders, and produced a small beaded purse. She carefully counted out 3 short gold threads, and draped them across one of Sygg's clawed digits. He wasted no time, smoothly twisting them around a silver loop on the inside of his eelskin belt, the captain's only article of clothing. "Welcome," Sygg said. "Now if you like to check any of your baggage, my apprentice is at your command." He fanned his barbels in a friendly manner and gestured along the pier, which hung over the racing water until it ended abruptly about 30 feet from shore. The only other paying passenger sat with her legs folded beneath her and her arms crossed at the pier's edge. The pilgrim's head was bowed beneath her wide-brimmed metallic hat. After a few minutes, in which no other passengers showed, Sygg turned on his tail and swam along the pier. He had 5 passengers. 4, really. It was not half capacity. But it was a good third of what he would have liked. Not bad for a slow day, in a slow season. Perhaps business was picking up. He continued past his apprentice and turned to round the end of the pier. The fact that Duga had little to carry, combined with the light load, convinced Sygg to let his apprentice handle the bulk of the work on this trip, in spite of the captain's misgivings. He hadn't warned his steward, but that was part of the training. If the youth couldn't ready the ferry magic on command, or if he couldn't sustain the shape water to keep the passengers as comfortable as possible, he would never become a true ferryman like Sygg. Before the captain had a chance to inform Duga of his plan, The Kifkin matron stopped short of 2/3 the way down the dock and threw out her hands on either side, stopping her brood short. The merry ferryman noticed immediately and swam quickly to the side of the dock. Even he couldn't reach eye level with the Kifkin here, so he cupped one webbed hand on the side of the mouth and called, "Messers, I'll need you at the end of the—" "Captain!" the woman said in surprise. "What is going on here?" "The meaning of what, missus?" Sygg replied with a shrug, shooting his steward a look that told the green youth to keep out of it. The Kifkin woman pointed at the solitary pilgrim. The pilgrim's skin burned ember red, and wisps of smoke curled out from beneath her hat edges. "The flamekin!" the Kifkin whispered, stealing a glance at the burning creature. "How can it be safe to carry one of them across the river? Doesn't the fire hamper your— Only if we let it, missus." Sygg sighed and realized there was no chance this woman would allow him to have an apprentice take her brood across the water. "I'll be happy to refund you your thread in the form of a voucher worth 3 round trips across the wanderwine, and that is your choice, missus. But our policies are clearly poised at the gate. No thread refunds." He flashed a row of neat, pointed silver teeth in an unwitting, hideous grin that pointed at the rickety wooden arch, to which was nailed a wooden sign, reading exactly that. "And really, missus," he added, taking another tactic, "haven't you ever received a message delivered by a flamekin, from some distant friend or relative? Why, to refuse passage to a flamekin would be uncivil." This took the matron aback. "No, I have not received, nor do I want to receive a message from one of those." "Nah, missus, I understand your trepidation, I truly do," Sygg said. "But she paid her fare like anyone else. Has she paid enough to guarantee the safety of my children? I think not. Ta-da!" Sygg stifled another sigh and kept his baubles still. "Flamekin fire doesn't burn like that, ma'am." "I smell smoke," the flustered matron cried. "I feel heat. Fire is fire, Captain, and this isn't the first time I've been ferried, you know. Your ferry is made of water, she is made of fire, and I may be just a simple country Kifkin, but I know that fire and water don't mix." "Missus," Sygg said, doing his best to keep the matron from slipping into hysteria, "she's not the first of her kind I've ferried, though, to be sure, we don't see many like her in these parts during the foggy season. Who knows what missives she carries to who, and who needs them? Have a heart, missus." When the Kifkin continued to sputter in protest, he continued, "Why, just look at her. She's hardly even glowing. This close to the river, why, I can't imagine. She is too comfortable, I assure you. Captain Sygg's ferry is the safest way to travel in all of Lorwyn. To Kifkin or Flamekin, or both." The Kifkin eyed the smouldering Flamekin, who showed no sign of heeding the ongoing debate about her presence. It was doubtful that the Kifkin woman had ever once seen the Flamekin in the flesh. Few Kifkin villagers went so much as a year without seeing a pilgrim pass through, carrying a bag of messages from whatever towns the pilgrim had been through recently. But clearly the matron didn't ever have the reason to interact with those pilgrims, so she presumably had no way of telling whether the flamekin was burning any more brightly than usual. The wide-brimmed hat tilted up, allowing Sygg to see the flamekin's blazing eyes. She smiled at Sygg, waiting. "If the flamekin lady has no objections," Sygg said, recognizing a fellow conspirator's smile, "we can take some extra precautions." The flamekin nodded. She must have seen this before, and didn't seem to mind what would be a significant inconvenience and discomfort. She'd already told the ferryman how eager she was to be across and done with the wanderwine, and Sygg nodded in return. "I won't even charge extra." He twisted his long torso and called to his apprentice, "Mr. Douga." "Aye," the youth spluttered, swimming in alarm to his master's side, only to feel Sygg's claw dig into his arm when he arrived. "Follow my lead," Sygg whispered out at the side of his mouth. "Answer, aye." "What?" Douga managed before another squeeze, one that drew just a bit of blood. "Shut him up." "Aye," he repeated at last, and tried his best to look confident. My associate is an accomplished ferryman in his own right, visiting from the northern lanes. Aye, Dougal said. I mean, I am. Sygg's barbels twitched. With the flamekin's permission, he went on, my mate will shape a comfortable sphere for our flamekin friend here. A sphere which will keep the protective skein of water between you and she. This magic being independent of my own ferry, will not and cannot affect my own performance. Your children could not be in safer hands than these, he finished, spreading the webbed appendages in question, palms up in a gesture of welcome. I'll expect a free ride the next time I pass through here, Captain, the flamekin said quietly. I suppose if anything goes wrong she'll be doused, the matron said. Very well, she continued, but I hope that we can be seated well away from that menace, whether she's flammable or not. Far away never did any good for anybody. She's bad luck. Sygg saw his apprentice cringe at the matron's words. To mention bad luck with your foot on the end of the pier. Well, Sygg thought, the good fortune of carrying a flamekin would probably cancel it out. And now, if you'll excuse me, it's time we prepared the ferry for your voyage. Please step back at least 3 paces, or I cannot guarantee your continued dryness. Wait! Cried a tiny buzzing voice that was in fact 3 voices speaking in perfect unison. A trio of winged fairies, 1 male and 2 females, emerged from the brambles lining the shore. They made straight for the ramp of the ferry boat. Each one was no larger than a songbird, and they hovered on their iridescent wings in perfect formation. The fairies were spindly and sharp, bipedal but hornet-like. Their bodies were striped and dotted with vivid bands of yellow, orange, and green. Their vibrating wings buzzed melodically, filling the air with a musical hum, and the trio left a glittering shower of rainbow colour in their wake. Their hard, laughing eyes sparkled with mischief and glee. One of the females was slightly larger than the other 2, who appeared to be nearly identical in size. It was common for fairy cliques to consist of a pair of twins and 1 odd sibling out, and this trio appeared to fit the norm, though the gender diversity was unexpected. Most cliques consisted of a single sex, and males were somewhat less common. Fairies! Cried the youngest kipling. Look, Mummy, fairies! They'll make us fly! Cried the boy. They most certainly will not, the matron snapped. They'd better not, she added under her breath, if they even can. Sygg sighed through his gills, and let slip the threads of shaped water magic he'd only just began gathering together. What did the fairies want? Passage? And why would agile flyers like them even need to book passage? Still, the ferryman could smell customers a mile away, and his gills were twitching again. No point in missing a fare on the off chance the tiny creatures even had thread between them. Welcome aboard, my little friends, he said. That is, if you're coming aboard. You'll have to decide quickly, I'm afraid. We're already running late. But, Captain, they fly, Dougal said, voicing the obvious at precisely the wrong moment. Why do they need us? We like fairies, one of the 2 smaller fairies. The male buzzed as the trio came to an abrupt hovering stop in front of the Kifkin matron's wide-eyed face. They're a real lark, the larger female added. Besides, it's snapping turtle season, the female twin finished. And some stupid reptiles think we look like food. Dougal's eyes shifted nervously from the fairy's feet and Sygg's impatient face. Just collect their fare, Mr. Dougal, Sygg said. We're tardy enough as is. It was rather unusual for fairy to travel by water, Sygg thought, but not unheard of. This particular clique had quite possibly travelled with him before, on a sheer whim. One could slowly go mad trying to figure out why the fairy did what they did, when they bothered to interact with the big folk. They rarely explained why they were being interactive, and Sygg had learned long ago that it was better not to ask. Not unless you wanted an hour-long session of word games and banter that left you exhausted, but none the wiser. Welcome aboard, Mrs. Enter. Thank you, Captain, the relatively big female said. Possibly they were not identical, but the trio flitted in their little orbits so quickly and constantly it was hard to tell one from the other, or which one had just spoken. "We don't weigh anything," the male said. One of the smaller pair was definitely male. "So we'll take your maximum discount." At this, for some reason, the females burst into laughter, seemingly designed to bore a hole into Sygg's brain. Then the male fairy joined in, and nearer as Sygg could tell, the sound did drill through his skull and out to the other side. "Ileona," the smaller female said, "pay the marrow before we get on people's nerves." "You're getting on my nerves, Visa," the big fairy Ileona apparently snapped. "You two do this every time we travel." "Missus," Sygg interrupted, "may I suggest we would be happy to carry you across the river for a price of a single kifkin." "Oh, that's fair's fair. Fairly fair, the ferry fare. Agreed. We'll pay the fair ferry fare." Sygg let his steward accept the single thread of gold the one called Ileona finally unwound from her tiny waist. The Fae wore no clothing as such, but these fairies wore plenty of gold thread to make up for it. The trio fell into private conversation as they floated a few feet above the other passengers, speaking in a pitch audible only to fairies, and perhaps Kifkin hunting hounds. They no longer showed any interest in anything but each other. Very good then, Sygg thought. What most denizens of Lorwyn called ferry magic was indeed magical. A gift from the ancient mirror, who had mastered the art of manipulating water. These days the magic was so much a part of the mirror as a people that its use felt natural as breathing, even to a novice. It was the ability to shape water into functional and beautiful forms that separated the ferryman from the fry, and Sygg would be the first to modestly admit he was one of those more talented ferrymen, working the wanderwine. With practiced, sinuous strokes of his tail, he drew away from the end of the pier. He effortlessly maintained his balance with a deft manoeuvring through the dueling currents that met his exact point in the river's tumultuous course. That alone was an art that most Merrow never needed to perfect, but ferrymen were an exception. The current was key. He placed his palms atop the water's surface, using the minuscule pressure against the surface tension. This pressure connected him instantly to the softer, slower currents of magic that drifted through the river and collected in something like a skin of vibrant mana where the wanderwine met the sky. At least that's how Sygg had been taught to visualize it, and visualization was what really made the whole thing work. He heard the kiflings gasp as he called aloud to the river to offer up a small part of itself for one of the children to use. In his heart, he wasn't certain the invocation was necessary, but Sygg liked to ask all the same. He willed the skin of the water to rise, and the water obliged, with a concave shape some 20 feet long and 15 feet across, which took form between the captain and his passengers. Sygg began to hum, a slow, melancholy tune he'd learned when he was younger than Duga. The half-shell sharpened and smoothed until it resembled a swirling but quite solid glass. The nadir of the shape flattened out until it was level with the rest of the river. Sygg's hum shifted in register and brought forth a shimmering rail that ringed the edges of the ferry. Another shift, and decorative water arches stretched to the height of 20 feet or more. It was also made entirely of water, perfectly contained in the shape, the currents continuing through the ferry without slowing. The key to getting them to move so efficiently at the right angles of the river. "Please step aboard, folks. We'll be getting under way," Sygg called. Once solidified, he could easily maintain the ferry's shape with a modest and mostly unconscious effort. "The flamekin goes first," the matron said, pointing at the pilgrim. "I won't have my children atop a raging river when your ferry melts out from under us." "I don't mind," the pilgrim said. She strode to the edge of the dock and extended a flaming hand. "Captain, will your apprentice seal me in before I step aboard?" "After," Sygg replied. Duga's much smaller spell was still adequately shaped. A moment after the pilgrim set foot on the smooth, glassy surface of this very special portion of the wanderwine, The edges of a sphere rose from the floor and enveloped her in a solid yet liquid prison. The sphere followed the flamekin wherever she moved. Duga even remembered to leave large gaps in the top of the sphere to allow the flamekin's flames to get plenty of fresh air. If the Kifkin matron noticed, she didn't mention it. The three Kiflings scampered around on the mirror-like surface of the shape-water saucer, to the dismay of the hunched, exhausted Kifkin matron, who had settled into the centre of the magical ferry, as far from the unshaped water as possible. She looked as if she might drop on all fours if anything upset her balance, her digestion, or both. "Mum," the oldest of the children, a girl of 8 winters, asked when she grew tired of making freakish faces appear on the outside of the pilgrim sphere, "why did you make the ladies stand in that bubble?" "That's a silly question, Eunice," her mother replied. "You don't want to learn how to swim, do you? Now hush, we'll be across soon. Can you not pass the time with your brother and sister? We've had a long journey, and there's a bit farther to go if we'll have those cakes ready for the tales." "What are the tales going to be about, Mummy?" Eunice's younger brother asked. "Will there be dragons?" "I don't know, Ergil," the matron said. "There might well be." "But, Mother," Eunice insisted, "how does the bubble of water keep the fire lady from—"
"It wouldn't if I focused on the task," the pilgrim said, adding wryly. "If I moved very, very quickly."
She stretched and popped her neck with a sound like 2 pieces of volcanic pumice grinding against each other. The pilgrim could see the Kiflings were not going to let her be. She decided to spare the matron another round of unanswerable questions.
"I don't really want to leave, though, so don't be afraid," she said,
adding with a pointed look at the Kifling's mother,
"any of you."
"Excuse me, Flame, miss," the Kifkin matron said with as much indignity as you could muster. "We shan't bother you, and I'd ask you kindly not frighten my children." "I'm not scared," Eunice said. "She said not to be afraid." "Yeah, Mum," Urgil agreed. "I'm not scared even more." "Children," the matron sputtered. "Why isn't all of you on fire, Fire Lady?" the younger girl asked. The flamekin, her face still hidden by the steel brim of her hat, laughed, and the glow beneath the wide hat brightened for a moment.
"I wear special fire lady clothes," the pilgrim said, holding her long arms wide and turning slowly around. "And I do have some control over what parts of me are burning at any given time, and how hot they get."
She thumbed the woven steel fabric of her travelling garments.
"But mostly it's this stuff, woven steel. We make it in the crags. My people, that is. We haven't much use for clothing in our homes, but when we wander like I do, it helps to keep you from setting anyone's furniture on fire."
Once the opening became apparent, the Kifkin siblings stumbled over each other with their questions about the strange pilgrim. "Why are you all alone? Can you shoot fire out of your eyes? Are you going to Kinsbale? We're going to Kinsbale. Are you going to listen to the tales? Why are you wearing a hat? It looks like a platter. Your fingers, can you shoot fire from your fingers? Do you really eat rocks? What is your name? Do you know any tales? What about your bum? Can you shoot fire out of your bum?" "Children," the matron barked, and this brought a sudden guilty hush to her audience. She was able to add with more restraint, "Will you leave her alone?" "Are you made of stone?" Ergil asked, boldly ignoring his mother.
"Not exactly," the flamekin replied. "Have you ever seen a campfire?"
"Of course," Riley squealed, happy to contribute to the conversation.
"The things at the base of the fire, the coals," Ashling explained. "That's sort of what I'm made out of."
"You're made out of coal?" Ergil asked, wide-eyed. "Not coal, coals, nitwit," Eunice said haughtily, "like at the base of a campfire."
"A little of both, actually," Ashling said.
"You're funny," Ergil laughed, "and you smell funny." "Well, that's just what happens when you eat nothing but rocks," Ashling said. "I knew it," Eunice said. "You do eat." The Kifkin girl's accusation was cut short when the smooth, concave shape-water ferry beneath them shattered like a pane of glass, splashing apart into heavy drops that moments later rejoined the rest of the river. The Kifkin family plunged into the wanderwine without even time to cry out. Ashling instinctively reached out for one of the nearest of the Kiflings, thrusting her arms through the silvery sphere that still held her, and her alone, above the surface of the river. She was able to wrap one glowed hand around Riley's forearm, and locked her hand in a death grip before the water cut off feeling below her elbow. She could only watch helplessly as the other two children and their mother bobbed up to the surface like corks, already several feet away. Riley shrieked and called for her mother, but to no avail. "Captain!" the flamekin heard Duga cry, and suddenly the abrupt end of their crossing was explained. An arbormander had surfaced and collided with the master ferryman, who must have been caught unawares. Sygg floated face down, apparently unconscious, as the adolescent but still huge amphibian gave the marrow a second smack with its flat tail. The blow knocked Sygg onto his back. Ashling could see no light in his glassy eyes. Sygg's panicked apprentice struggled to keep Ashling and the wailing Kifkin aloft as he swam furiously to his fallen master. He appeared to have completely forgotten the other two passengers. "Duga!" Ashling shouted. "Leave him! You're going to lose the Kifkin!" "Mummy!" Riley added. "But," the apprentice began, then he saw the bobbing, wailing Kifkins and their mother. Urgil and Eunice had managed to snag their mother, who was doing her best to stay on the surface. She could swim at least, but with the weight of the two Kifkin dragging her down, there didn't seem to be much hope for them. "Do something, Fire Lady!" Riley cried. "Make the fishman do something!" "Duga, for bog's sake, do something!" Ashling hissed as her floating shapewater prison buckled, along with the apprentice's concentration. "Something that doesn't drop me in the water, please," she added. Duga didn't answer her, and most of the sphere's upper half disintegrated and splashed against her shins and feet, which fell numb. But at least her arm was no longer enveloped in the shapewater. Careful not to burn the Kifling's forearm, she allowed her flame to dry everything up to her wrist, which brought back most of the feeling in her hand. With effort, she kept her footing and her grip on the terrified Kifling, but she didn't know how long she could maintain either. Riley's panicked flailing wasn't helping. "Bog it, Duga! Get them before they drown!" Ashling called. "And, don't drop us either if you can help it." "But I'm only a student," Duga protested. "Captain Sygg is the one." "You've got to do it," she called. "He's either dead or unconscious, and if it's the latter, he'll live. But those children can't swim, and you're the only ferryman in sight." "Of course I can't swim either," she added to herself, "and I doubt this Kifling can, for that matter. I can barely stand." It was more luck than balance that kept her on her two numbed feet as Duga finally relented and headed downriver after his floundering passengers. He reached out with one hand, summoning power from the currents of the wanderwine, keeping Ashling out of the river with the other. Even less of a sphere remained. She was essentially standing upon a flat disk of water at this point. Riley yelped as her feet dipped into the cold current. The arbormander struck so quickly, Ashling didn't have time to warn the apprentice of his mortal danger. 1 second, Duga was waving an affirmative hand sign at the flamekin, and the shapewater was starting to grow more solid as the apprentice brought his emotions under control. The next second, there was an explosion of white water, and the gigantic amphibian burst from the river. Its mouth opened wide to swallow Duga in a single gulp. His last scream was almost over before it had the chance to begin. "Oh, bah!" Ashling managed before the disc beneath her feet dissolved. But to her surprise, immersion did not follow. In fact, she didn't lose an inch of elevation, and was able to lift Riley's feet from the water. "Settle down, we've got you," buzzed a tiny female voice from her right shoulder. "Gah!" Riley cried. "Fairies!" "You should really cut down on the sandstone, Flamekin," said the male fairy from her left shoulder. "It's going straight to your hips." "You too, Kifling," the female added. "Less sweets, more meats." The third fairy appeared before Ashling's eyes, hovering with her tiny arms crossed over her chest. "Well," the one called Ileona said, "don't you have anything to say?" "You want my thanks, you have it," Ashling said. "But what about them?" "They're just kifkin," Endry the male fairy said. "That's my family," Riley cried. "They're not important enough," Visa agreed. "There are plenty of kifkin, no offense." "Then why save me?" Ashling interjected. "Because you're—" "Shut up, Endry," Ileona said. "Why are you complaining, Flamekin? Would you rather we dropped you in the water? And look on the bright side. You've still got one kifkin there. How many do you need?" "Mummy!" Riley shouted. "Mummy!" "You heard her. The girl wants Mummy," Ashling said. "Now help those people or—" "Or what?" Visa buzzed. "You're not really in a position to make demands, Brimstone Breath." Without a word, Ashling swatted at the sound of the voice with her free hand. She was rewarded with a squeal and the sudden icy grip of the river water around her legs as a single fairy was left with the job of keeping her in the air. With an incredible effort, the flamekin kept Riley elevated, though the girl started crying again. Ashling could barely blame her. If she herself had tear ducts, she'd be right there with the kifling. Instead, she said weakly, "That hurt, but I'll throw the kifling close to shore and swap the other one unless you help that family. I don't know why you want to keep me alive, but if you're going to do it, you're going to have to save them all." "Can I kill her, Ileona?" Endry asked. "Or at least that kifling? My ears are bleeding." "Yes, please do," Visa said, floating down into Ashling's field of vision and rubbing her right antenna, which was bent. "We can find another one, can't we? And I know we don't need any spare kifkin." "No," Ileona ordered. "Keep quiet, both of you. Endry, get those two to shore, and don't drop the flamekin. She'll have to hold onto that kifling if she wants to keep her." "As you say," Endry replied. He nodded, oddly businesslike and almost martial. "Visa, come with me," the larger fairy said to the smaller sister. "You are so lucky," Visa said to Ashling with a glare. The flamekin didn't feel particularly lucky with the river almost up to her waist. The arm holding Riley screaming with pain that alternated with infuriating numbness brought on by little unpreventable splashes from the terrified kifling she'd held aloft. Endry, it seemed, could not keep Ashling completely out of the water, so it was all she could do to keep her upper torso, limbs, and head alight. Still, they weren't far from shore. When she was on shore with Riley, she would burn away the residue of the wanderwine. "All right," she heard Visa shout. "I've got two of them. These kifkin weigh a lot less than Flameface." "I have the mother," Ileona said. "Stop kicking, bog damn you," she added, apparently to the matron, who was cursing the blue streak and kicking wildly. If the kifkin were kicking, they were still alive. So far, so good, Ashling thought. She felt oddly protective of the kiflings. It had been some time since she'd spoken with flesh folk that were so accepting. The shore was only a dozen feet away. Soon she could ask the fairies why they'd been so intent on saving her in the first place. She wasn't sure she liked their protective attitude. She felt droplets splatter against the rim of her iron hat as a shadow fell over her, and she saw Riley's waterlogged, awestruck siblings pass overhead. Unis clutched Urgil, and vice versa as Visa struggled mightily to keep the pair in the air. A moment later, Ashling felt her body rise from the river and heard Riley cheer. "Hooray! We're saved!" Riley cried. Yes, definitely a cheer, but for who or what? "Endry," she croaked. The dull agony in her legs had her on the verge of blacking out. "Who?" "Not me," the exhausted fairy buzzed, "but I'm not complaining." "Steady, my flamekin friend," Sygg's familiar voice growled from upriver. "You too, fairy. Keep her on her feet and I'll lift you from below." "Hello," Ashling gasped, wearily turning her head to flash a lopsided orange smile at her rescuer. "Captain!"